The shuttle descended through the thin atmosphere, and Ambassador Vexor watched the gray surface of the unnamed moon grow larger in the viewport, and he felt something he had never experienced in his long life. He felt small. The Dominion ambassador had once commanded fleets that darkened the skies of conquered worlds, and he had personally overseen the extinction of 3 species, and he had laughed at the pleas of the helpless because their weakness amused him. Now he came alone and armed to meet the human who had broken his empire in less than a year. Admiral Una Park was waiting for him when he landed, and she stood beside a monument that had not existed 7 months ago, and behind her stretched row after row of carved stone markers, 30,000 names etched into the rock of this dead world. "You came," Una said, and her voice was neutral and controlled. "I had no choice," Vexor replied, and he hated how true that was. "The Dominion is collapsing, and our slave species are in revolt, and our vassal states have abandoned us, and our military has been bled dry by your endless attacks." Una nodded, as if this was exactly what she had expected. "Walk with me," she said. She led him through the memorial, and the names surrounded them on every side, and Vexor found himself reading them despite himself: Yunho Beek and Minji Yoon and Seonjae Cho and Hyunwoo Kang and thousands more, and each name represented a life that had been ended for no reason, except that the Dominion found their deaths amusing. "I want you to read them aloud," Una said. Vexor stopped walking and stared at her. "What?" "Every name," Una said, and her voice carried no anger, only absolute certainty. "You will read every name aloud, and you will not stop until you have finished. That will take hours. It took me 4 hours at the Concordat assembly," Una replied. "You can manage the same." Vexor wanted to refuse and wanted to rage and wanted to remind her that he was still an ambassador of the Dominion and deserved respect. But he looked at her eyes and saw something there that made his protests die unspoken. He began to read. The names blurred together after the first hour, and his voice grew hoarse after the second, and by the 3rd hour, he understood why she had made him do this. Each name was a person, and each person had been real, and each death had been unnecessary and meaningless and cruel. When he finally finished 4 hours later, his throat was raw, and his legs ached, and something inside him had shifted in a way he could not identify. "Now we can talk," Una said. They sat on a stone bench overlooking the memorial, and Vexor found himself unable to meet her eyes. "What do you want?" he asked, and his voice came out as barely a whisper. "Territory and resources and submission, and I will give you anything. You will release every slave species in Dominion space," Una said, "immediately and unconditionally." "Done. You will submit to war crimes tribunals," she continued. "Every officer responsible for atrocities will face justice." "Agreed. You will fund the reconstruction of every world you have ravaged, and you will provide reparations to every species you have harmed." "Yes." Una paused, and Vexor waited for the final demand and expected it to be something terrible and something that would destroy the Dominion completely. "And every Dominion child will learn these names," she said. "They will learn what was done here and why it was wrong, and they will carry this memory forward so that it never happens again." Vexor looked up, and confusion crossed his alien features. "That is all?" "That is everything." He studied her for a long moment, and his predatory mind searched for the trap and the hidden agenda and the secret cruelty behind her terms. "You could destroy us," he finally said. "Your alliance grows stronger every day, and our empire is fractured and broken, and you have the power to wipe us from existence." "Yes. Then why do you not do it?" Una turned to look at the memorial and the names of 30,000 dead, and her expression softened into something that might have been grief. "Because that is what you would have done," she said. "And we are not you, and we never were." Vexor felt something break inside him, and it might have been pride, and it might have been certainty, and it might have been the worldview he had built over centuries of conquest. I do not understand you. He admitted. No, Yuna agreed. You never did, and that is why you lost. She stood and offered him her hand, and after a long moment, he took it and let her pull him to his feet. The galaxy is changing, she said. The old rules served their purpose. But they failed because they only worked for those who chose to follow them, and those who preyed on the helpless faced no consequences. And now? Now, there are consequences, Yuna said. But there is also mercy for those who earn it, and the Dominion can choose what it wants to become. Vexor looked out at the memorial, and the names, and the gray desolation of this moon that had become the birthplace of a new galactic order. We thought you were weak, he said. We thought your compassion, and your mercy, and your care for the helpless made you easy prey. Many have made that mistake. How do you do it? He asked, and genuine curiosity colored his voice. How do you show such mercy to those who deserve none, and such ferocity to those who threaten what you protect? Yuna smiled, and it was a sad smile and a tired smile, but also somehow a hopeful one. We learned long ago that true strength is not about what you can destroy, she said. It is about what you can protect, and what you can build, and what you can heal. 1 year later, Yuna returned to the memorial, an ambassador. Torvan walked beside her, and the gray moon was no longer silent, and empty ships came and went constantly now in delegations from 100 worlds and pilgrims, who wanted to see where the old galaxy had died, and the new one had been born. The Concordat has changed, Torvan said. The old rules remain for those who follow them, but there is a new understanding now, and those who violate the peace will face consequences. Yuna nodded and said nothing. I did not understand your species before, Torvan continued, and his compound eyes reflected the memorial stones in 100 tiny fragments. I thought your violent history made you primitive and dangerous. And now? Torvan considered the question carefully before answering. Now I understand that your history made you something else entirely, he said. Something the galaxy needed, but did not know it needed. What is that? The Kreth ambassador looked at the 30,000 names, and then back at Yuna, and when he spoke his voice carried something like reverence. You are the ones who remember, he said. You carry your dead with you, and you let their memory guide you, and you never forget what cruelty costs. Yuna placed her hand on the nearest stone and felt the carved name. Beneath her fingers, we remember everything, she said. The good and the bad and the terrible and the beautiful, and we let it all shape us. She turned to face. Torvan in her eyes held the weight of 30,000 souls and 1,000,000 years of human history. That is what makes us human, she said. We remember, and because we remember, we keep trying to be better. The sun set over the memorial, and the names glowed gold in the fading light, and somewhere in the galaxy, a new order was being born, an order where mercy was strength and memory was power, and those who preyed on the helpless would never laugh at surrender again. Commander Sareth Kale of the Dominion Third Fleet had never known fear in his 200 years of service, and he had conquered 11 worlds and enslaved 6 species and burned civilizations to ash without a moment of hesitation. Now he stood on the bridge of his flagship and watched his empire begin to crumble, and he felt something cold crawling through his chest that he did not recognize. Report, he demanded, and his voice came out sharper than he intended. We have lost contact with the Var shipyards, his tactical officer replied, and the young officer's scales had gone pale with stress. The supply convoy from Sector 7 never arrived, and our fuel reserves are at 40% and dropping. How? Sareth demanded. The humans have been at war with us for only 6 months, and they were supposed to be primitives, and they were supposed to break within weeks. No one on the bridge had an answer. The war had begun exactly as the Dominion expected, and human ships were smaller and slower, and their weapons were less powerful, and their numbers were laughably inadequate against the might of the greatest military force the galaxy had ever known. But the humans did not fight like the Concordat species, and they did not follow the ancient rules, and they did not behave in any way that made sense. There were no formal declarations and no designated battlefields, and no scheduled engagements. The humans simply attacked, and they attacked everywhere, and they attacked constantly, and they never stopped. Sareth had expected grand fleet battles where Dominion superiority would crush the enemy in a single decisive engagement, and instead the humans refused to gather their forces and refused to stand and fight and refused to die the way proper enemies were supposed to die. They struck supply lines and vanished before retaliation could arrive. And they targeted fuel depots and communication relays and recruitment centers, and they fought at night and in asteroid fields and in the gravity wells of gas giants where Dominion sensors were blind. Commander, his communications officer interrupted, and her voice trembled. We are receiving a transmission from the Kethera colony. Kethera was a Dominion border world, and it held 3 million citizens and a significant military garrison, and Sareth had been trying to contact them for 2 days. Put it through. The view screen flickered to life, and Sareth expected to see destruction and death and human atrocities that would fuel Dominion propaganda for generations. Instead, he saw something that made no sense at all. Human soldiers were distributing food to Dominion civilians, and human medical teams were treating the wounded, and human engineers were repairing infrastructure that had been damaged in the fighting. This is Admiral Una Park, a voice said, and the human commander appeared on screen, and she looked tired, but her eyes were clear and sharp. Your colony has surrendered, and your military forces have been neutralized, and your civilian population is under our protection. Protection? Sareth snarled, and rage flooded through him. You dare to claim you are protecting our people? Your people did not attack our colony ship, Una replied, and her voice was calm and measured. Your people did not laugh while our children begged for mercy, and your military did, and your military has been dealt with accordingly. The transmission shifted to show the aftermath of the ground battle, and Dominion soldiers lay dead in the streets and their weapons scattered around them, and not a single one had been allowed to surrender. We differentiate. Una continued, and something cold entered her voice. Your civilians will be treated with dignity and respect, and your warriors will receive exactly the mercy they showed our people on the Evergreen. The transmission ended, and Sarah stood in silence and tried to understand what he was facing. This was not how war worked, and enemies did not treat your civilians better than you treated theirs, and enemies did not show compassion to the helpless, while showing none to combatants. Commander, his tactical officer said, and his voice had gone hollow. We are receiving reports from the Neth slave worlds. The Neth were a species the Dominion had conquered 4 centuries ago, and they had been broken and obedient for generations, and they pose no threat to anyone. What about them? They are rising. The officer replied, and disbelief colored every word. The humans contacted them and offered them freedom and alliance, and they are rising against us. Sareth felt the deck shift beneath his feet, even though the ship was perfectly stable. That is impossible, he said. The Neth have been enslaved for 400 years, and they do not even remember what freedom means. The humans are reminding them. More reports flooded in, and one after another, and each worse than the last. The Tarathi vassal states were defecting, and the Kreen labor colonies were in open revolt, and species that had served the Dominion for centuries were suddenly remembering that they had once been free. How are they doing this? Sareth demanded, and his voice rose to a roar. How are they turning our own conquests against us? No one could answer him because no one understood. The Dominion had built its empire on a simple truth that the strong ruled and the weak obeyed. And this truth had been proven over millennia of conquest and domination. Now a species that had been traveling between stars for barely 2 centuries was teaching the galaxy a different truth. A communication request appeared on his display, and it bore the seal of the Galactic Concordat. Commander Sareth Kale. Ambassador Torvan said when the connection opened and the Kreth diplomat looked exhausted and something had changed in his demeanor. The Dominion has requested Concordat mediation, and Ambassador Vexer wishes to negotiate with Admiral Park. Negotiate? Sareth spat the word like a curse. The Dominion does not negotiate and we conquer. You conquered, Torvan corrected, and his voice carried something that sounded almost like pity. Past tense, and the humans have shown the galaxy that your strength was built on the weakness of others, and now the weakness is turning against you. Sareth wanted to argue and wanted to rage, and wanted to destroy something, but the tactical display behind him showed the truth. That his fleet was running out of fuel, and his supply lines were in ruins, and his empire was fracturing from within. Where does Vexer want to meet? He asked, and the words tasted like ash. Admiral Park has chosen the location. Torvan replied, she wants to meet on the moon where the Evergreen died, and she wants Vexer to see what the Dominion's strength actually accomplished. The connection closed and Sareth Kale stood alone on his bridge and stared at the stars, and wondered how everything had gone so wrong so quickly. He had spent 200 years believing that mercy was weakness and compassion was foolishness, and strength was the only thing that mattered. He watched an empire built on those principles begin to collapse, and he wondered if perhaps he had been wrong about everything. The Galactic Concordat Assembly had not seen a full gathering in over 300 years, and the chamber was designed to hold representatives from every major species in the galaxy. And today, every seat was Philogena Park walked through the massive doors, and she wore the black uniform of a fleet admiral because humanity had promoted her by unanimous vote, and she carried a data tablet and nothing else. The representatives watched her pass, and some with curiosity, and some with pity, and some with the kind of condescension she had grown accustomed to over the past month. She did not acknowledge any of them. The central podium rose from the chamber floor like an altar, and Yuna climbed the steps and stood before the assembled galaxy and waited for silence. Honored representatives, she began, and her voice carried clearly through the vast space. 1 month ago, the human colony ship Evergreen was attacked and destroyed, and 30,000 of my people were killed. She activated the holographic display, and the evidence played out before them, and weapon signatures, and forensic analysis, and the final recording of Mayor Junho Beek. The assembly watched in uncomfortable silence, and some looked away, and some covered their sensory organs, and some simply stared with expressions that ranged from horror to something that looked almost like boredom when the evidence concluded. Yuna did not immediately continue, and instead she waited, and the silence stretched. A door at the far end of the chamber opened, and a creature entered. That made half the assembly flinch. The Dominion had sent an ambassador for the first time in centuries, and his name was Vexer, and he was massive and armored, and his forearms ended in claws that could tear through steel, and his eyes burned with predatory intelligence. I wondered when you would get around to this, Vexer said, and his voice was deep and resonant and utterly without remorse. Yes, we destroyed your colony ship, and yes, we killed everyone aboard, and what of it? Gasps echoed through the chamber, and Yuna remained perfectly still. They were in space adjacent to Dominion territory. Vexer continued, and he seemed almost amused by the reaction around him. They were weak and undefended, and weakness invites predation, and this is the natural law of the universe. They tried to surrender, Yuna said, and her voice did not waver. Surrender is for those who have something to offer. Vexer replied, and he bared his teeth in what might have been a smile. Your colonists had nothing we wanted except their deaths, and their deaths amused us. The assembly erupted in outraged whispers and diplomatic protests and formal objections. And through it all, Vexer stood untouched and unconcerned. The Dominion has watched your concordats little play wars for millennia, he said, and contempt dripped from every word. You call yourselves civilized because you have agreed to pretend the conflict has rules, and you fight your scheduled battles and exchange your prisoners and tell yourselves that this makes you better than the beasts you evolved from. He turned to address the full assembly, and his voice rose to fill the chamber. Real civilizations take what they want, and the strong survive, and the weak perish. And this is not cruelty, but simply truth, and humanity learned this truth on that nameless moon. The assembly fell silent, and all eyes turned to Yuna, and she stood at the podium with her data tablet and her black uniform and her absolute stillness. "May I respond?" she asked, and her voice was quiet and polite. The assembly speaker granted her permission, and Yuna activated her tablet and cleared her throat. "I'm going to read some names," she said, and then she begged Jung Ho Beek and Minji Yoon and Xianjie Cho and 30,000 more, and she read each name clearly and carefully, and she did not rush, and she did not pause. The assembly shifted uncomfortably as the minutes stretched into hours, and representatives whispered to each other, and some tried to interrupt, and some tried to leave. Yuna kept reading. 4 hours passed, and her voice grew hoarse, but she did not stop, and she would not stop until every name had been spoken. When she finally finished, the chamber was utterly silent, and even Vexer had gone still, and something flickered in his predatory eyes that might have been uncertain to set down her tablet and looked directly at the Dominion ambassador, and when she spoke, her voice carried the weight of 30,000 souls. "You killed our children while they begged for mercy," she said. "You laughed at their surrender, and you believe this makes you strong, and you have made a mistake." Vexer shifted, and for the first time his confidence seemed to waver. The Concordat urges restraint. The assembly speaker interjected, and his voice was desperate and pleading. "Humanity must not provoke a conflict with a species that has never been defeated, and we counsel patience and diplomacy and time." Yuna ignored him completely, and her eyes never left Vexer. "The age of civilized war is over," she said, and each word fell like a hammer blow. "We are coming for you, and not to defeat you, and not to make you surrender." She descended from the podium and walked toward Vexer, and the Dominion ambassador tensed as she approached, and his claws flexed involuntarily. Yuna stopped directly in front of him, and she was small and fragile compared to his armored bulk, and she looked up at him without fear. "We are coming to make sure you never laugh at mercy again." She walked past him and toward the chamber doors, and the assembly watched. Although in stunned silence, Vexer called after her, and his voice carried a note of genuine curiosity beneath the bravado. "Do you truly think you can defeat us?" Yuna paused at the door and turned back, and a cold smile crossed her face. "We do not need to defeat you," she said. "We only need to teach you what we learned long ago and what you have clearly forgotten." "And what is that?" Yuna's smile faded, and her eyes went hard and empty. "That those who prey on the helpless have chosen to live in a universe without mercy," she said. "Welcome to that universe." She walked out, and the doors closed behind her, and the Galactic Concordat assembly sat in silence and contemplated the end of 12,000 years of civilized war. The unnamed moon hung in the void like a tombstone, and the wreckage of the evergreen was scattered across its gray surface like the bones of some enormous beast. Yuna stood at the viewport of her ship and stared down at what remained of 30,000 human lives. As she felt something inside her go very quiet and very cold. "Weapon signatures confirmed," her tactical officer reported, and his voice was carefully controlled, but she could hear the tremor beneath it. The Evergreen was attacked by military-grade plasma cannons and kinetic bombardment systems, and the attack pattern suggests multiple warships coordinating their fire. "They never had a chance," someone whispered behind her, and Yuna did not turn to see who had spoken. The 3 Concordat observer vessels maintained respectful distance, and their crews watched through long-range sensors, and Ambassador Torvan had joined Yuna on her ship because he said he needed to witness this himself. "I recommend we deploy ground teams," Yuna said, and her voice came out flat and empty. We need to recover whatever evidence we can, and we need to bring our people home. The shuttle descended through the thin atmosphere, and Yuna led the first team. Personally, because she could not ask anyone to face this without facing it herself. What they found was worse than she had imagined. The Evergreen had not been destroyed in a single attack, and instead the ship had been systematically torn apart over what the forensic analysis suggested was several hours, and the attackers had taken their time. "General," one of her soldiers called out, and his voice cracked on the word. "You need to see this." Yuna followed him through the wreckage and into what had once been the colony ship's main assembly hall, and she stopped in the doorway, and her mind refused to process what her eyes were seeing: bodies everywhere, and not just adults, and not just crew members and children and medical staff and people who had clearly been on their knees when they died. White flags hung from improvised poles throughout the chamber, and surrender signals had been broadcast on every frequency, and distress beacons had been activated the moment the attack began. None of it had mattered. They tried to surrender, her soldier said, and tears streamed down his face, and he made no effort to hide them. They followed every protocol, and they did everything right, and it did not matter. Torvan entered behind them, and the Kreth ambassador made a sound that Yuna had never heard before, and it might have been a scream, and it might have been a prayer, and it might have been both. "This is not war," he said, and his voice trembled with something beyond horror. "This is not even conquest, and this is simply slaughter." Yuna walked through the chamber, and she looked at every face, and she forced herself to bear witness, because someone had to remember, and someone had to carry this forward. She found the colony's administrative center, and the computers were damaged, but her technicians managed to recover fragments of data, and among those fragments was a recording. Mayor Jung-ho Beek appeared on the screen, and he was an older man with kind eyes and gray hair, and in the recording those eyes were filled with terror and despair. "If anyone finds this," he said, and his voice shook, but he forced himself to continue. "We were attacked without warning and without provocation, and we tried to surrender, and we tried to negotiate, and we offered them everything we had." Explosions echoed in the background of the recording, and screams and the sound of weapon fire. "They are laughing," Jung-ho said, and something broke in his voice. "They know no one will come, and they know no one will care, and we are going to die here, and the galaxy will do nothing, because we are just humans and we do not matter." The recording ended abruptly, and Yuna stood in silence, and she felt the weight of 30,000 deaths settling onto her shoulders. Torvan approached her carefully, and when he spoke, his voice carried genuine anguish. "General Park, I am sorry, and I am so deeply sorry, and no species should suffer this." "Who did this?" Yuna asked, and her voice was quiet and controlled, and that control was more frightening than any scream. "The weapon signatures matched Dominion technology," Torvan confirmed, and he seemed to shrink into himself as he spoke. "This attack bears all the hallmarks of their methodology. And what will the Concordat do about it?" Torvan hesitated, and Yuna could see him searching for words that would not come. "This occurred in unclaimed space," he finally said, and each word seemed to cause him physical pain. "Technically, the Dominion has violated no laws because they are not bound by our laws, and they never agreed to our treaties. So nothing," Yuna said, and it was not a question. "We could file a formal protest," Torvan offered, and even he seemed to recognize how hollow the words sounded. Economic pressure over time might encourage them to offer some form of compensation, and perhaps in 50 years, they might even apologize. Yuna turned to face him, and the Kreth ambassador took an involuntary step backward because something in her eyes had changed. 50 years. These things take time. Tovan said, and his voice had gone weak and uncertain. The Concordat has learned that patience prevents larger conflicts, and rushing to judgment only leads to more death. Una said nothing, and her silence stretched on, and Torvald found himself wishing desperately that she would shout or cry or rage. Instead, she simply looked at him, and her eyes held something he could not name, and it terrified him more than any threat could have. General Park, he tried again. What are you going to do? Una turned back to the recording, and she replayed Mayor Junho Beek's final words. And she listened to him say that no one would come, and no one would care. They were wrong, she said, and her voice carried across the ruined chamber like a funeral bell. Someone came and someone cares. She walked out of the administrative center and back into the assembly hall, and she looked at the bodies of 30,000 humans who had died begging for mercy from enemies who had none to give. A Torvald followed her and watched her and waited for her to speak. She never did, and somehow her silence was the most terrifying thing he had ever witnessed. General Una Park stood on the observation deck of the Volanthi command carrier and watched two armies prepare to kill each other in the most polite way imaginable. The battlefield below had been selected 3 months in advance, and both sides had agreed on its boundaries through 17 rounds of diplomatic negotiation, and the weather had been checked and double-checked to ensure fair conditions for all combatants. She found it absurd, and yet she could not deny that it worked. You seem troubled, General, Ambassador Torvald said, as he glided up beside her on his 4 segmented legs. The Kreth diplomat towered over her by nearly 2 meters, and his chitinous plates gleamed blue-green in the afternoon light, and his compound eyes reflected her face back at her in 100 tiny fragments. Not troubled, Una replied, and she kept her voice neutral and professional. Just observing. Ah, yes, observing. Tovan clicked his mandibles in what she had learned was the Kreth equivalent of a knowing smile. Your species has much to learn about civilized conflict, and I am told humans once fought wars that killed millions, and I am told you burned entire cities and poisoned your own world with radiation. Una said nothing because everything he said was true. The Galactic Concordat has maintained peace through the laws of honorable conflict for 12,000 years. Torvald continued, and his tone carried the gentle condescension she had grown accustomed to hearing from every alien species she encountered. Wars still happen, because conflict is inevitable among thinking beings, but we have learned to manage them and contain them and prevent them from consuming everything below them. The battle began. Volanthi forces advanced in perfect formation, and their crystalline armor caught the sunlight and scattered it into rainbows, and the Kreth defenders responded with precisely calculated volleys that were designed to disable rather than destroy. Casualties would be minimal, and prisoners would be exchanged over dinner, and tomorrow both sides would file reports with the Concordat detailing exactly how many soldiers had fallen and how many resources had been expended. War between the Volanthi and Kreth had lasted 6 years, and it was fought over mining rights to an asteroid belt that neither species truly needed, and yet honor demanded that the dispute be settled through combat. So they fought on scheduled days, and they followed ancient rules, and they treated the whole thing like an elaborate game. Your system prevents extinction-level wars. Una acknowledged, and she meant it as genuine praise, even though part of her rebelled against the pageantry of it all. I can respect that, but you do not understand it, Torvald said, and his voice carried something that might have been sympathy. Your species is young, and your instincts are still raw and unrefined, but in time, you will learn, and humanity will take its place among the civilized peoples of the galaxy. Una wanted to argue, but her communicator chimed with an urgent priority signal, and she excused herself and stepped away from the observation window. Message came from Earth Command, and it was marked with the highest classification level, and it contained only 3 words that made her blood. Run cold colony ship Evergreen. Silent the Evergreen carried 30,000 human settlers, and it had been traveling through unclaimed space on its way to establish humanity's newest colony, and it had sent regular status reports every 6 hours without fail for the past 8 months now. There was nothing. Una returned to Torvan and requested immediate transport back to the human embassy, and she needed to investigate, and she needed to find out what had happened to her people. Where was the Evergreen's last known position? Torvan asked, and something in his demeanor shifted when she told him. The Kreth ambassador went very still, and his compound eyes dimmed in what she had learned to recognize as fear. That area borders Dominion space, he said, and his voice dropped to barely above a whisper. General Park, you must be very careful. Tell me about the Dominion. Torvan's mandibles clicked rapidly in obvious distress, and he looked around as if checking whether anyone else might hear them. The Dominion refused to sign the Concordat. He finally said, they rejected our laws and our customs and our entire philosophy of civilized conflict, and they believe that the strong have a natural right to take from the weak, and they have never lost a war because they do not fight wars as we understand them. What do? They conquer, Torvan said, and the word carried 12,000 years of galactic history behind it. They enslave and they consume and they destroy, and the Concordat learned long ago that the only way to survive them was to avoid them entirely. Una felt something cold settle in her chest, and it was not fear exactly, but rather a terrible premonition. Has anyone ever fought back against them? Several species tried in the early centuries, Torvan replied, and his voice carried the weight of extinction. They no longer exist, and the Dominion erased them so completely that we do not even remember their names. Una straightened her spine and met Torvan's compound eyes with her own. Steady gaze. I need to find out what happened to my people. General Park, I urge you to consider carefully, Torvan said, and genuine concern colored his alien voice. If the Dominion has attacked your colony ship, then those people are already dead, and going to investigate will only put more lives at risk. Those are my people, Una said, and her voice carried no anger, only absolute certainty. I will not abandon them without knowing what happened. Torvan studied her for a long moment, and something shifted in his expression, and she could not quite identify what it was. The Concordat will send observer vessels with you, he finally said. I will accompany them personally, and perhaps I can help prevent a diplomatic incident. Una nodded her thanks and turned to leave, and she had arrangements to make in ships to gather in 30,000 souls who deserved to know that someone was coming for them. She did not know yet what she would find, and she did not know that the galaxy was about to change forever, and she did not know that she would be the one to change it all. She knew was that her people had gone silent, and that she would not rest until she understood why behind. Her Torvan watched her go, and his compound eyes reflected her retreating form in 100 tiny fragments, and for the first time in his long diplomatic career he felt something he could not name. It might have been fear, and it might have been hope, and it might have been the premonition that the careful order he had spent his life maintaining was about to come apart. The laws of honorable conflict had kept the galaxy safe for 12,000 years. He wondered if they would survive first contact with humanity's grief.